Well, in a recent video about clean air zones and ULEZ, ultra-low emission zones, link to that down below, I stated every ICE, internal combustion engine, produces toxic, poisonous, carcinogenic fumes from their exhaust pipes. And as expected, I did get a bit of a reaction. I also got a few facts about why EVs are worse than ICE, so here's a follow-up, or part 2 if you like. I'm Dave, welcome to Dave Takes It On. Well, anyone interested can check out the comments section, but one common theme is, well, the UK energy supply is still reliant on fossil fuels, so you're simply relocating the pollution to somewhere other than your tailpipe. Okay, so let's look at that because, well, at first glance, without any research at all, this actually seems to contain certain truths. Well, clean air zones have one purpose, and that is just to ensure that we, the citizens, are able to breathe clean, fresh air, which I fully support. Nobody should be forced to breathe in polluted, toxic, damaging, carcinogenic gases. You may demand your right to drive what you choose, but more of us now are demanding the right to breathe clean, fresh, healthy air for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. Which has the priority? Interesting point. Well, virtually all clean air zones are located in cities. There's none I've found that are located on Bodmin Moor, Snowdonia National Park, the Lake District National Park, or in the Peak District National Park. The air in those areas is already fairly healthy, as any fumes spewed out by the relatively few cars that drive there are pretty instantly whisked away and diluted by the wind or dissipated by natural diffusion or a combination of them. In the cities, the volume of fumes spewed out by the millions of ICE cars is such that the air cannot dissipate by diffusion, because much of the surrounding air is also heavily laden with the same fumes. It's got nowhere to diffuse to, nor can it easily be whisked away owing to the construction of multiple tall buildings, alleyways and everything. These are the reasons why the Great Smog affected London and not Cornwall, because obviously residents in both areas burned coal for their primary heating. It's just down to numbers. So point 1, if all the fumes were simply taken out of the tailpipes, out of the cities, and relocated to where our power stations are, which by the way are never in cities, we would achieve a major benefit for all city dwellers. And that accounts for about 80% of the population. According to IBIS World data, about 80-something% of us actually live in large towns or cities. Now, I'm not promoting this as a strategy because it doesn't tackle the pollution issue. But if we actually did that, it would at least allow most of the UK population to breathe cleaner, fresher, healthier air that didn't hinder, cripple or kill them. So just on its own, that's better than what we do currently. But there's obviously much more. Well, a typical ICE internal combustion engine has an efficiency of around 25%. Some more, some less, but that's typical. But that's the power the engine actually produces, moving pistons up and down, turning the crankshaft round. To move the wheels requires things like clutch, gears, drive shafts, differentials, all sorts of things, much more. And they soak up about 20% of that power. So if you put 100 units of fuel in, you get 25 units of movement at the flywheel, but then you lose 20% of that, and you end up with about 20 units for actually moving the wheels. That's the equivalent of 20%. In contrast, a modern gas turbine electricity generator runs at nearer 60%, so an awful lot better. So let's imagine our grid is made up of 100% gas-fired power stations. It isn't, You put 100 units of gas into each one, and that each would produce 60 units of electricity. Now, you're going to lose some of that in transmission losses, and you're going to lose a further 10% in what we call round-trip efficiency. This is the losses during charging and discharging an EV battery. They're not 100% efficient. Then they have a much smaller, maybe 10 or 15% loss in a much simpler drivetrain. We don't have clutches and differentials and all stuff like that. Well, this would still be considerably more than twice as efficient, producing around twice the power and considerably less than half the pollution. That's a good result. But of course, our grid is not 100% gas turbine generators. Let's see what it really is and answer the question, what were you going to have to burn when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine? Well, if we take a quick look at today's typical day, it's about lunchtime. It's typical in it's just stopped raining, but more is forecast for later. The sun is well hidden behind the clouds. Solar, if we look on the National Grid Live, is currently 10.9% of the power in the grid today, and wind is 23.4. That gives a total of 34.3. Tiny little 0.5% is hydroelectric. Fossil fuel, by the way, 0% coal, yeah, absolutely zero, 0%, 26.4% gas. Nuclear, a non-fume producing energy source, makes up about 12.7%. So well over 50% of our power is renewable and or produces no fumes. How about when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine? Well, sun's not shining right now, and also it never does at night. So here I thank the grid for their data. This is National Grid Live, because I can see that at no time in the last year has wind produced zero electricity on a particular day. Yeah, odd turbines will be stationary for odd periods of time, but out at sea, in our offshore farms and the Highland or Cornish onshore farms, zero actually doesn't happen throughout the whole country at the same time. We always get something from somewhere renewable. And over the whole of last year, renewables produced 38.1% and fossil 30%. But why is fossil fuels so high? This is a financial decision as a result of the way our grid is operated. Now, I launched a video on about the grid a while back, link to that down below, but in simple terms, we don't have a national grid as most people imagine it to be. National Grid plc was created and shares in it were sold off decades ago in a big privatisation sale. Over the years, those have been bought and sold, and today they are almost all in the hands of banks, fund managers, asset managers, pension funds, investment funds, and various foreign entities like Abu Dhabi Investment. And those funds in turn have been bundled up into products like mutual funds, ETFs, managed equity portfolios, separately managed accounts, commingled funds, and there's all sorts of things. And these products themselves in turn are invested in by pension funds and private investors. Well, National Grid plc is run by a board that appoints the various officers to become the chief executive officer, chief finance officer, chief technical officer, and the like. And these people are tasked with making sure those officers make a good, healthy profit running the grid as a financial business. It must make a profit, must reduce costs, must maximise profits, so that all of those that have invested directly or indirectly in the National Grid plc can get interest on their investment, on their money, or dividends on their shares, or they can buy and sell shares and make a profit. It's purely a financial business, just happens to produce and sell electricity. Well, decisions as to which power is used are taken by the officers, with the board monitoring the results. Individual shareholders, well, they're able to vote in elections to approve or deny board nominees, but they make up a really tiny fraction of the total shares, so their votes are usually overwhelmed, leaving the world's largest, richest, most powerful financial institutes and individuals to make the decisions. And guess what? They almost always vote for whatever makes more profit. So at present, in really simple terms, renewable energy is by far the cheapest and obviously the cleanest electricity you can produce. And there's already far more renewable power available at certain times than the grid can actually use. This is on a regular basis. The national grid controls the incoming power, and at times the grid shuts down generators or the output from the generators because they are producing more than we are actually using. Because renewable energy is intermittent, the grid needs to invest heavily to be able to use it all. We need different switchgear, we need balancing mechanisms, and more important, we need grid-connected storage, batteries. Plus the grid also has to connect in these massive offshore wind and solar farms, connect them into the grid and connect the grid into storage farms and electric vehicle charging stations as they come online. Can anyone see where this is already heading? Well, the board and officers would much prefer to not spend a penny more than they absolutely have to, and so continue to operate the grid as a largely fossil fuel based grid, even though it is clearly not that any longer. Connecting the huge wind farms like UK's largest, which is Hornsea 2, that's located 60 miles offshore, that's going to cost money to connect, and the grid is sure not going to volunteer to pay that themselves. Can anyone now see why Labour has proposed to end all this and launch Great British Energy, that the people of Britain will own, not the investors, and they'll control it and they will benefit from it? And can anyone see how the richest, most powerful financial institutions and private investors in the whole world might not be 100% behind seeing that becomes a success and primarily benefits the British population who use the electricity? So for now, our grid is actually slowly turning green and renewable at the cheapest cost and the slowest rate they can get away with. And the only control the government had until now was Ofgem. And you can probably get an idea of how pathetic they take the responsibilities if the water utilities are anything to go by. They cannot force the grid to do things. They merely have to go to some or many of the officers or board members and ask, or more likely beg, for them to do things. Well, back to the grid, because despite all, the grid is going green, but the management still leans heavily on the fossil fuel industry, as that to them is a known entity and easy to make a profit from. The grid will at peak times shut down generators if they're producing too much, and they tend to shut down the renewables. Renewables to them are a leap into the dark. But it keeps getting worse because the grid doesn't actually generate any electricity itself. Not at all, not even 1 watt. You heard right, it does not generate any electricity. Its job is to select and make sure that the input of electricity from individual private generators is enough to meet demand and then get it to where it is needed. The grid, National Grid PLC, is merely a distribution network, taking it in, moving it, releasing it. And they're finding it more and more difficult. You see, the larger generators, they obviously generate electricity, and more of those are choosing to build wind farms, solar farms, hydroelectric plants, and increasingly looking into tidal power and fusion power. They're looking into all these. First of all, the green. Secondly, they're proving to be cheaper. And don't forget, every single one of us that has solar panels up on the roof is also a generator. We are generators. And the grid is required by law to connect our PV systems into the grid. Any system below 3.6 kilowatts, they can't refuse. That's the law. But add up 1.4 million houses, each generating, let's say, just 1 kilowatt at midday on a sunny day. You get 1.4 gigawatts of power, which is about 5% of the total power the grid uses at that time. Now, National Grid PLC does not like this, but it's the law, it has to put up with it. The grid is going green, but far too slowly. It could move very much quicker with the right motivation. But even today, it's already well over 50% green and renewable, and recently on several consecutive days, the grid in the UK ran totally on renewable energy. It can do it, it's technically possible, we've done it for several days. The reason it doesn't do it more often is they can't make as much money if they do. Money talks. Well, just like the fossil fuel industry is desperately hanging on to the old ways, so the grid is desperately hanging on to their old ways. In their quest for profit for private financial institutes and the ultra-rich private investors. So the comments are not correct. It is not simply transferring the pollution from the exhaust pipe in the cities out to the power station. That alone would have a huge benefit. But the power stations are much more efficient than cars, and people in cities would at last breathe in clean fresh air on a regular daily basis. But the pollution would not simply be moved intact to those generators. See, first, the generators, just like EVs, many of them do not produce any exhaust fumes at all. Over half of all the generators currently produce no fumes, no gases, no pollution in producing electricity on a daily basis. Your solar panels, the offshore wind farms, zero fumes. And it would be so much easier for the government to reduce the total amount of fumes that those remaining fossil fuel plants produce. A single law passed today could cut the maximum allowable pollution from any generating plant in half. Simple as that. Those that can't comply, they must shut down, just like our once huge coal-fired power station network. It's all gone. Today, there's one left, and that one will be finally closing this year, never to be fired up again. It is simply not needed as other sources come online. And neither should those gas-fired power stations be needed either. Cut pollution maximums this year, Labour. Then cut the limit again every single year until we have no fossil fuel powered electricity generation left. Well, the grid does not produce any electricity of its own, as I said, so if the UK government tackles the generators, the grid will merely have to accept 100% renewable energy. There won't be anything else. It will simply lose the power it currently has to select what fuel generates the power that they select for the grid. And if it can't, or it won't keep up, it should be allowed to go bust or taken over by the government, just like is happening to our water companies I mentioned. They could not or would not invest in the business, in the infrastructure, as there was no profit in it for them. These are all privately owned, investment owned. Today, most of them are on the verge of going bust. Let them go bust. Government take over. It doesn't cost you a penny. You then have to run it, and that costs money, but it doesn't cost you to buy them out. If they go bust, lose all their shares, that's it. The government now owns it, buys it for £1, they can operate it. Multi-billion investors, investment funds, private investors should no longer be allowed to run any of our utilities for their own profit. Oh, so sorry for the rant, but our grid is already over 50% renewable on a long-term basis, and the old generators that produce most of the pollution have long since gone. Most of the gas turbines are quite efficient, relatively clean, certainly compared to coal-fired power stations or petrol engines with exhausts. Now, if the government reduced the amount of pollution and greenhouse gases they're currently allowed to emit by half, that would cut the EV indirect pollution by half. So it wouldn't be just transferring it, it'd be cutting it in half and transferring it. Well, that's something that's very difficult to do if you ask all of the ICE cars for them to reduce their pollution. That is much more difficult. Well, several people also commented that PM 2.5, these are tiny particles, still an issue, and this is what I'm currently researching for a future video. That'll be out soon. But this video and my last video were specifically examining exhaust pipe emissions and the fumes, gases and pollution they create. Every single ICE car has an exhaust, and every single exhaust produces emissions, gases, fumes when the engine's running, and even when the vehicle is stationary. In fact, a lot of the vehicles actually produce more when they're stationary. And the exhaust of diesels is also the largest single source of PM2.5 particles. These are the microparticles we're getting worried about. EVs produce zero equivalent emissions, fumes and gases, or pollutants when driving, or stationary, as none have an exhaust pipe. Now, PM2.5 particles, they're produced by tyres, brakes, road wear, a variety of other sources. They're a totally separate subject. That'll be covered in the upcoming video. On this one, we're looking at what comes out the exhaust pipes is what we need to ban. Now, on a final note, I was taken to task from someone for comparing asbestos with ice fumes and gases. In fact, I didn't. I did state that the effects on the human body of breathing in over a long period of time asbestos dust and the fumes, gases and toxic things released by burning fossil fuel are both equally deadly, which they are. Not the same, but both equally deadly. So once again, for all you who shout and scream about your rights to be able to drive whatever ICE car you choose, that must be balanced by the rights of those that breathe in the air that is polluted by the exhaust gases that you spew out of your exhausts. Well, to give you an idea where this one's heading, I would remind you a similar battle was fought a long while ago. It was called passive smoking. You might remember that one, because who won? It wasn't the smokers. It was the passive smokers. They have a right to breathe in fresh air and clean air. So look at whose human rights prevailed in that case. Well, anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed or at least learned something from this video. If you have, please click the like button. If you want to see more, please subscribe. Every single subscriber makes a big difference to the YouTube algorithm. As always, massive thanks for the support from our Patreon members. I'm Dave.